On October 16, 1962, the world stood on the brink of a nuclear holocaust. For 13 harrowing days during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the fate of the world hung in the balance, entirely dependent on the negotiations between two key world leaders, John F. Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev. During this crisis, the United States and USSR engaged in a political and military standoff over placement of nuclear weapons in Cuba. After escalating conflicts following the failed Bay of Pigs invasion and the presence of nuclear ballistic missiles, cautious negotiations between Kennedy and Khrushchev allowed for the demilitarization of the conflict, leading to a compromise that prevented a nuclear holocaust.
The Cuban Missile Crisis, on the brink of nuclear war.
How did America end up in this situation? During World War II, the United States and Soviet Union fought as allies against the Axis due to a shared hatred for the enemy. However, the relationship between the two nations was tense. Capitalist-run America had long been wary of the communist Joseph Stalin's tyrannical reign. In return, the Soviets resented America's skepticism of the legitimacy of their nation and delayed entry into World War II. After the war ended, these grievances ripened into an overwhelming sense of mutual distrust and enmity. However, the conflict was truly ignited by the rivalry between the United States and Soviet Union during the Cold War, a battle of egos. Tensions started with the overthrowing of the Batista government, which was originally friendly with the United States. Fidel Castro then seized power inside of Cuba, severing ties with the United States and declaring Cuba as a socialist nation.
Y los pueblos entonces tienen dos alternativas: o doblegarse o luchar. Y luchar de la única forma en que pueden llegar a vencer al enemigo.
This antagonized the United States, as they now had a hostile socialist nation just 90 miles off of Florida. During Operation Mongoose, started in 1960 by President Eisenhower, the CIA attempted to assassinate Castro multiple times, but Castro miraculously survived. In an effort to end Castro's rule once and for all, Kennedy approved the Bay of Pigs invasion in April of 1961, where they attempted to use brute military force to force Castro away from power. Led by the CIA, Kennedy assembled an army of ex-Cuban exiles who had opposed Castro in the past. Then an invasion was launched, where America still had plausible deniability. After days of intense combat, the ex-Cuban exiles lost, ensuring that Castro would stay in power. Additionally, America was exposed as the aggressor in this conflict, causing Castro to solidify his power and call upon the Soviet Union for help. Premier Khrushchev, the leader of the USSR at the time, responded by shipping military aid to Cuba, as well as resources and protection. In return, Cuba agreed to let the Soviet Union place nuclear missiles on their island.
And when Castro, after the Bay of Pigs, declared officially that he joined the Soviet bloc, he put this obligation on my father's shoulders. But if you will not protect the small piece of land, you will lose your face. Your allies would not trust you.
Using high-tech U-2 spy planes, the American government discovered multiple launch sites, along with increased military defenses. Because Cuba was only 90 miles away from the United States, this gave the Soviet Union a huge advantage in terms of launching the first nuclear attack. Vital American areas were in range, including Washington, D.C. and New York City.
That's how people can sleep at night after 1957, is knowing we have mutually assured destruction. It would be suicide for Khrushchev, the premier of Russia, to send nuclear weapons or missiles to the United States. But once they're in Cuba, there's no more deterrent, right? It would take 15 minutes, maybe, for a missile to get from Havana to Miami. And then get a hold of the president back then. He didn't have a cell phone, right? You can't text him. So can you even get the message to the president for him to decide what to do? So this is truly terrifying, this idea of having a missile that close. So millions of Americans are watching as Kennedy very calmly says, there are nuclear missiles pointed at us.
Unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere.
The crisis had begun. In October of 1962, Kennedy immediately decided on a plan of action. Because Soviet ships were responsible for delivering arms to Cuba, Kennedy blockaded Cuba in order to prevent Soviet reinforcements. This blockade encircled Cuba and prevented Soviet ships from from resupplying or further arming Cuba. Of course, this caused tensions to soar. The hardliners of America demanded immediate military intervention. For example, Curtis LeMay, a general of the Air Force, proposed that the US invade Cuba and considered the resolution the biggest defeat in our nation's history. 25 years later, LeMay also asserted that they could have gotten the communists out of Cuba as well. It may be easy to argue in hindsight, but it was much wiser of Kennedy to err on the side of caution and disregard the advice of the belligerent man.
There are people to this day who will look at the Cuban Missile Crisis and say Kennedy was weak. To this day. Most people, the kind of consensus is that he was cool-headed and he thought through the decisions, he was trying to avoid war, and he was thinking globally. But there are people to this day who said that's a sign that he's too soft.
Arguably the most critical stage of the crisis, negotiations between Kennedy and Khrushchev single-handedly determined the course of history. With the threat of nuclear war looming, Kennedy and Khrushchev cautiously traded letters over the course of 13 days. After Kennedy formed the Executive Committee of the National Security Council to handle the crisis, he penned a letter to Khrushchev outlining his intent to avoid plunging the world into war, which could only result in catastrophic consequences to the whole world. Initially, Kennedy's attempts at resolving the conflict were not well received by Khrushchev, who argued that Kennedy was no longer appealing to reason. Their dispute left the conflict at standstill for days. If they had remained unable to look past their personal and ideological differences, nuclear war could have erupted. In the final days of the crisis, both leaders faced pressure to ignite war. On October 26th, Castro urged Khrushchev to initiate a nuclear attack in the event of an American invasion of Cuba, arguing that the Soviets must never allow circumstances in which the imperialists could carry out a nuclear first strike against it. Despite Castro's advice, Khrushchev proposed to remove Cuban missiles if the US did not attack Cuba and remove their own missiles in Turkey. On the other side of the world, the Executive Committee attempted to convince Kennedy to initiate military action, yet he too remained firm in his goals and advocated for a settlement that conceded to Khrushchev's demands regarding the removal of missiles in Turkey. Finally, on October 28, 1962, the crisis concluded with a compromise between the two countries. Publicly, the Kennedy administration stated that they would respect Cuba's territorial sovereignty, while the Soviets would remove their missiles in Cuba. In private, Kennedy agreed to remove their missiles from Turkey as well. Fidel Castro was angry that the Russians had backed down to the Americans, where they no longer had Soviet nuclear protection. However, the tensions of the Cuban Missile Crisis faded as this period of nuclear crisis ended.
Sometimes a crisis sobers people up and becomes a precondition for reconsidering the conflict and looking for ways to reduce the confrontation.
In August of 1963, a direct telephone hotline connected the US and Soviet leaders in Washington and Moscow, which would be used to help quell similar situations. In addition, the SALT treaties, the agreement between the superpowers not to supply any other countries with nuclear weapons, arose from the crisis, though the Soviets felt convinced that they needed to invest in more intercontinental ballistic missiles. President Trump's decision to pull out of the Iran nuclear deal mirrors Kennedy's stance during the Cuban Missile Crisis. In order to procure a more favorable compromise with Iran and display America's power, Trump recently demanded that tougher regulations be imposed on Iran. His actions directly parallel how Kennedy blockaded Cuba during the crisis to reach a compromise more favorable to the US and prevent both himself and America from appearing weak. Additionally, the compromises made during the Cuban Missile Crisis parallel today's nuclear crisis with North Korea. Just like America compromised to not use the hardline military approach of bombing Cuba, today the US has not directly bombed North Korea, instead opting for a more conciliatory approach. Recently, at the 2018 Inter-Korean Summit, Kim Jong-un and Moon Jae-in peacefully negotiated over issues like denuclearization. Currently, after some obstacles, President Trump and Jong-un have decided to hold a Singapore summit in the near future to further compromise. For all intents and purposes, the Cuban Missile Crisis was one of the most worrisome times in the history of the world. One wrong decision on either side could have led to nuclear war, and the world as we know it would not even exist. Thus, it was vital that the actions Kennedy and Khrushchev took were careful and the compromises they made were appealing to both sides as to prevent what would have been the most destructive conflict ever.
We shall be prepared if others wish it. We shall be alert to try to stop it. But we shall also do our part to build a world of peace where the weak are safe and the strong are just.